Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell. You'll get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And when I'm not asking Bruce, hey, how big was Batista's? Well, you know. One of the things I like to do is help people save money. And if you're watching this video right now and you're in a 30-year loan, man, you're overpaying your single biggest bill and you may not even realize it. I want you to do a little experiment for me. Take your calculator out, multiply your monthly house payment by 360 payments. That's how many payments there are in a 30-year loan. That big scary number, that's your total of payments. You're looking at that number? You know you can do better. Keep more of your own money right now and go to savewithconrad.com. Or maybe you've got credit card debt. Man, it's not a matter of if I can save you money with that. Your average interest rate on a credit card is more than 20%. And by the way, all the interest you pay on those credit cards, it's not tax deductible. Whereas the mortgage interest, well, that is tax deductible. So if you owe this debt, it's up to you how to pay it back. Doesn't it make sense to get the cheapest rate possible and the greatest tax deduction possible? Find out how much money you can save right now for free at savewithconrad.com. You don't need perfect credit. Even scores in the 500s can be approved, and it's no cost out of pocket. But maybe best of all, we're licensed in more than 40 states. We can help more families than ever before. But how much can we save you? Find out right now for free with a quick quote from savewithconrad.com. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to Dark Side of the Podcast, Episode 2, The Life and Crimes of New Jack. I know you're probably expecting some more Grill and JR content. JR show comes out tomorrow, but we figured, hey, we're all quarantined. Let's enjoy a little bonus content and talk about last night's epic episode from Dark Side of the Ring, all about New Jack. It happens Tuesday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern on Vice. And joining us today, just like we did a few days ago for Chris Benoit, the producers of the series, Evan and Jason. Evan, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having us.
Jason, I'm excited to break this one down. Let's get right into it and talk about New Jack. How difficult was this to get New Jack on board with a project like this?
Well, it's actually kind of a funny story. I'll let Evan take the wheel on this one because he had to directly call him and reach out to him, which was, pretty crazy unto itself.
Well, just to back up for a second, this is one of the episodes that was heavily requested by viewers from last season. A lot of people wanted to see New Jack, wanted to see his story, or wanted to see the mass transit incident covered on the show. It was definitely one of, I would say, the top 10 most requested stories that people wanted us to cover. So when it came time to do season 2, I got New Jack's contact information, gave him a cold call, and I have to admit was definitely intimidated. And was, Mr. Jack, when I got him on the phone. And he basically said 3 words, more or less, on the phone. It was basically, we have this television show, and we'd love to do an episode about you. Would you want to do that? And he was like, yeah. I was like, okay, so we'll just come down to visit you, and yeah. Okay, so should I just call when I get there? Yeah. And it was 3 yeahs, basically. So we're operating on a wing and a prayer. This interview is going to happen based on 3 yeahs on a phone. So we get to his town, and the night before, I just had to confirm to make sure that this interview was on. And so I give him a call, and I just realize that the venue that we got. Now, one thing about the venue is that New Jack's, you look at shoot interviews that New Jack has done over the last, 10 plus years. And most of them are, in that Ramada Inn setting or somewhere, right, which has a great texture to it and is amazing. But we wanted to try and do something a little bit more epic than that for this. And Jason, I can't remember if it was your idea or how it came about, but
yeah, no, we did some location scouting just on the, online, and we came across the movie theater, and we thought that would look so cool to place New Jack in that. And it had balconies too. So it was kind of it had a lot of symbolism in a lot of ways for the interview. But I think it we were on the road already for a while. And when we arrived into town that night, it was late, and I think there was even some mess ups with like our bookings at the hotel, and we were just like already exhausted. We finally got into our beds, and I remember I thought I should just look at the location before we like go there in the morning, and that's when we realized. I remember looking at the map and being like, wait a minute, it's saying it's like an hour and a half away from where we're staying. Like we're supposed to be 10 minutes from this place. And I remember I went to your hotel door, knocked, you answered the door, and I told you, and you just like gave me that look that we've had many times where it was like, oh shit.
Yeah, and it was like, and I had realized, because we had told New Jack, oh, we're just going to shoot at this movie theater. It's going to be super cool. It's going to look amazing. It's like 10 minutes from your house. No problem. And then you realize, oh my God, this place is an hour and 10 minutes away. How, and it's like the wrong interview to have an amateur mistake, like the wrong interview. Because I just was immediately picturing myself like, in the ring, getting mass transited, like, like from this. Like my father screaming at me, no, my son. And just like, oh man, what's going to happen? So I had to call him, and thankfully, you have to use a little bit of salesmanship. And it was kind of like, look, the venue we were supposed to use, that's 10 minutes away, they had some electricity problems. And but good news, we got a new movie theater. It's even better. And we have a limo on the way to pick you up right
now. I remember you called the production manager and you were like, whatever you do, just do it exactly the way you would do it as if you were picking up Dwayne Johnson and bringing him to the location.
That's what I said. Yeah. And so, and then everything worked out. And the movie theater that we did get, like, the one that we had originally booked that was, over an hour away, was amazing. And it was just like, New Jack, like, I was texting with him, like, is there anything we can get you? And he's like, vodka and orange juice. And so we had like, bright and early in the morning, had some vodka and orange juice there for him.
Yeah, and the movie theater had it there.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
They just gave it to him.
That's right. And then he shows up to the venue, and and Jason, you could take it from here, but there was no small talk.
Yeah, basically, like he rolled up. Usually, in most cases, like it's hard to get to know our subjects before we ask them to sit down and talk about some of these very intimate moments in their lives, and so we try to make the most of the time that we have with them. And so when New Jack rolled up, there was just absolutely zero small talk. And I feel it was so like uncomfortable in a lot of ways, because we were trying so hard to like connect through, and it was just like he didn't want to talk until the cameras were rolling. And it wasn't until like later on in the interview he said something along the lines of he said, I walked into this building as New Jack, and I'm leaving this building as New Jack. And that is when I thought, oh, right. Like, we just got worked.
Well, it was also like, I think one of the other reasons we like to connect with our subjects a little bit beforehand is obviously, wrestlers can be closed off because they've been trained to be closed off, or, they do have another side of their persona. And I think with New Jack, like the more that you research New Jack and the more you've looked at his shoot interviews and some other things he said over the years, his stories kind of evolve, but also sometimes you can see he opens up about his childhood, or he's more lucid about his childhood in certain interviews. And we had done a lot of research about that aspect of him, like what really is his story growing up.
Yeah, because we thought too that maybe we could connect with him just on like a wrestling level, because we knew that he was like he may have hidden it over the years, but he was like a full-on wrestling fan, a total mark, like when he was a kid. And like we did find this one story where he told this story. I don't know if it's true at the time when he told it, but he told this story of standing outside an arena, and he had a poster that he made for Dusty Rhodes, and he was like holding it up and he was cheering for Dusty as he was like walking by him, and Dusty like totally like snubbed him, I guess. And it like just rubbed him in such a wrong way. And it always stayed with him. But when we asked him about that, he denied it completely. And he just wasn't open to talking about being a fan.
A wrestling fan.
Business. Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, that was just something that we like an area we really wanted to try and access for this interview. And he did touch upon his childhood in the episode. I mean, you see it, but it's pretty much to the extent of as far as he was willing to go. But it was definitely one of the more memorable interviews we did in all of season 2, maybe even in the whole show. In terms of when he got to the venue, he was very cold, no interest in small talk, but when the camera was on, he was on.
I know this is a weird question, so forgive me for asking, but when a guy takes a quote unquote booking like this and agrees to do, the documentary, is this something he's compensated for? Is he feeling like this is a paid New Jack appearance?
Well, I think the thing is that, when he got there, I don't think he knew what Vice was, or he didn't know what Dark Side of the Ring was.
Right.
Like, I remember when I'm talking to him on the phone about like, hey, we have this TV show, it's like, it just wasn't really registering. He kind of was looking at it just like a shoot interview or, just some, I think like one of those, interview things. And so I think when he showed up, and obviously our setup is more robust than your typical shoot interview is in terms of the cameras and the lights and everything. So I remember halfway through the interview, we took a break, and he goes over to the vodka and orange juice table, and the only thing he kind of said to me during that break was, "Are a lot of people going to see this?" is what he said. And I think maybe that's, and I didn't want to say, well, yeah,
Sure.
or anything like that, because I didn't want it to necessarily influence the way he was going on camera. But there was kind of a disconnect, I think, a little bit in terms of really what he was doing at the time, or what he was participating in.
Well, you can definitely tell, at least from my perception of the way he's been sort of promoting it on social media, he was excited about the opportunity to have his story in front of a big audience. I mean, that's sort of the vibe you guys got as well, right, Jason?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's the only way I've had like kind of any correspondence with him since is kind of through social media. He's like DM'd me a couple times. Just like the other day, I posted a picture of the New Jack figure that we filmed in the episode, and I kept it, and I just posted a little video on my Instagram of it, and he was like so surprised that I had his action figure, and I was just like,
that is also my action figure, and I will want that. I do want that back.
That's right.
So you took that.
It. Hey, you
took that
across this border to get it.
Yeah, no, you took that, and I could not believe that.
I got to tell you, the action figure piece of this particular episode really got my attention because I don't know, I guess I never really closely examined the ECW New Jack action figure, and he references it in the documentary when he's talking to his mom, sort of tongue in cheek, saying, "How many other sons do you know that have an action figure in Toys R Us?" And then to sort of hype the episode last night, he posted a selfie of him with probably his favorite vodka drink. And in the background are a bunch of action figures. And I wouldn't have guessed that New Jack was a collector or a quote unquote fan of his own stuff and kept some of his own stuff. But I think that's probably another clue into his real life fandom. Let's talk.
Yeah. Actually, Evan and I talked about that last night because we saw on the After Dark show, he was interviewed just with Skype and is in that room. And I saw all the action figures on the wall, and I wrote Evan, and I was just like, wow, look, like he really is a fan of this stuff.
And he also said on Twitter last night too, someone asked him about that moment in the episode, like, getting his action figure in Toys R Us. And he actually commented on Twitter saying it was the highlight of his career. Like that was the crowning achievement for him, was to get his own action figure. So another clue.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And this really is sort of, an interesting character to dive into because, we've often talked about the line of where does Jerome Young end and where does New Jack begin. I'm sure you guys are in an uncomfortable place, but when you're actually on site with him, if you're starting to get sort of the New Jack character, is there a way for you to delicately say, you know, we really want to talk about Jerome Young as a kid without sort of blowing the whole shoot? How do you balance that, Evan?
Well, that definitely was like, you know, because when I format my interview questions for all the subjects, I tend to consider how I think or how I anticipate the interview is going to go, and if there's anything super difficult or anything really you know, sensitive in that material, I'll kind of structure it towards the end. And that was something that I did for this, which is, you know, because you want to warm up with the person, and you want to see if you can get them into a rhythm and get them to trust you more or get them to open up to you more. Because then when you get to those parts that you know he might or someone might be guarded about, then you can really get a you know, like a better, more truthful, more sincere answer. And that's what we did. And I remember after we got through the whole story, I circled back around to his childhood, and you know, by the end of the interview, he just was so impassioned. And that's the part of his interview where I remember he got like the most vocal, the loudest when he was talking about his family. I mean, when you see it on last night's broadcast, I mean, I would say 70% of it is bleeped out when he's talking about his family. So I don't even know if you can really understand everything that he's saying, but you know, it definitely from his story, I mean, it was a pretty difficult, you know, wild, you know, him actually growing up. And then one other thing that didn't make the episode that actually they ran a clip of in the After Dark segment is they talked about, or they showed the clip of him doing his first ever convenience store robbery, which he had done, like, I think in his, his early teens or something. Yeah. And we shot a whole reenactment scene of that, and they played that as like a deleted scene. So we kind of did get into his whole background as you know, growing up in this horrifying domestic situation, and then, you know, becoming kind of a small time criminal, and, you know, doing some of these convenience store robberies, and then eventually, I think in his senior year of high school, he actually got caught, and police came into his classroom and pulled him out, and then he actually went to jail for, I think, over a year or two, maybe 2 years, I think it was, and he did open up about his experience in jail and all the crazy stuff he saw, you know, during that whole time, which definitely, you know, I'm sure shaped him in many ways.
But in a lot of cases too, we find that like when you're doing these interviews, it's like within usually the first hour, it's like you're getting all the stuff that they've been telling over the years, over and over. It's kind of programmed, and it's not till I feel like after that first hour or hour and a half that you start to break through to get new information. And like Evan was saying, New Jack was just starting to open up to us in a way that was really getting interesting.
Totally.
Talk to me about the actual set. You know, how many guys are there on site when you're sitting down with New Jack?
It's just Evan and myself. We have a sound recordist, Adam Burke, and we had another camera operator who I think at that time it was Danny who was with us.
That's right.
But yeah, it's just we keep it really small and tight, and we just want it to be like as intimate as possible. And there's been times where it's just been Evan and myself and a camera as well. But yeah, we always find like it's just the more intimate we can make it, it's just I think we get more or like better material.
Evan, how different is this particular episode? Because most of the folks that are really the subject of this series are no longer with us. Of course, last week it was mostly about Chris Benoit, and coming up, we've got Dino Bravo and Jimmy Snuka and Owen Hart, and a lot of these guys are no longer with us, but here New Jack is still, you know, the central figure, and he's still alive to tell his story. How different does that make this episode from a storytelling component?
It's a good question, because, you know, when we set out to do this episode, as I was mentioning earlier on, it was one of the most, you know, highly requested stories that we tackle. And when we were looking at this, we were like, okay, how are we going to tell this story? Jason and I looked at the mass transit story, that whole aspect of the New Jack saga, and realized that could we get a full hour out of this? I wasn't sure we could get the full hour out of just that story. And then when we started researching New Jack more, we started to see that the story really is about because we always like to examine the blurred lines aspect of wrestling, reality versus wrestling fiction. That's always been a key theme that we've explored in the show since the very beginning. And that theme was really evident when looking at, how New Jack started. And I will admit, I had a total blind spot to New Jack's career in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. That was something that was totally new to me, outside of the OJ promo, which definitely was, on YouTube and is incredible. But his whole body of work in Smoky Mountain was something that I wasn't aware of at the time. So that going from that, and then how his character escalated, over the course of 15 or plus years, 20 years, in terms of going from having this series of incidents that take place in the ring where you're really seeing the blurred lines aspect. And then it gave us the opportunity to examine, where do you draw the line between wrestling, performance, and assault? And that became kind of this fascinating gray area that really only exists in the world of wrestling, right? So that was kind of the more of the story we wanted to tell. And it was unique for us because we don't typically do bio stories. We don't typically, in this season, we have a few of them, but it was definitely a first for us in terms of structuring like a more bio approach to an episode. Whereas most of the episodes we do kind of focus on one event, one kind of, controversial event or something. And so for us, it was different in terms of being able to, structure and tell someone's life growing up all the way through until present day. And of course, having New Jack here to speak about it, just having his perspective. And I think that gives it a whole other layer to this, because you see through all of these horrifying moments in the ring that we're talking about, he's completely remorseless about any of these moments, which could have resulted in something more serious. There was definitely a chance and an opportunity where any of these incidents could have resulted in something more extreme. And so we wanted to explore that as well. And that also kind of plays into, is this Jerome Young talking or is this New Jack talking?
Yeah, because one thing we're very interested in, and something that Evan and I kind of do a little bit, is we really romanticize the wrestlers who really blurred those lines. Like, that's why I think we got so into Bruiser Brody, is that like it was so hard at the time to figure out who was the real person opposed to like the character. And then when you're and characters like Abdul the Butcher and guys who like come from that era are just so fascinating to us. And so here you have like New Jack, who kind of in a lot of ways toes that line, because it really is hard to decipher who is Jerome Young opposed to New Jack. And New Jack knows that, and he's very aware of it. And what's interesting is he's very aware, I think, of how like wrestling really like celebrates its legends, and he knows that his legend will like live on past him. And I feel in a way he's kind of protecting that legend. And so in some ways it's like the way he shows no remorse for some of these acts. I tend to wonder if that is still really truly him, or is that him playing into the character because he knows that legacy will live on.
Yeah, good point.
I mean, you kind of hope that he does have remorse and that he's just instead showing favor to his legacy. I mean, isn't that what you would hope for, Evan?
Oh, I mean, definitely. Yeah, for the sake of humanity. Yeah, I would. Yeah.
Well, speaking of humanity, you said a moment ago that you had sort of a blind spot to his Smoky Mountain run. Everybody knows, I shouldn't say everybody, most hardcore wrestling fans are familiar with the mass transit incident. Did you know about the Vic Grimes incident, the Gypsy Joe incident, and the deal in Florida with the guy William Lane?
I knew about, like, going into this project, I knew about the mass transit incident. Not to the extent that we would go, like how far the rabbit hole would go once we were working on this. Not at all. I knew about, I don't think I knew about the Gypsy Joe thing. The Vic Grimes thing I'd definitely seen before, because that was such a viral clip.
Yeah.
I I didn't know really about the Gypsy Joe thing, and then the William Jason Lane thing, not at all. I mean, I think maybe I had clicked on it, it didn't really fully register to me when it was kind of making the rounds. But once we got the angle of that footage that we use in the show, and then it was like, oh my God, that was truly horrifying, that whole thing.
Let's talk about mass transit. Let's transition there. This was such a tape trading bonanza when it first came out, and then there was so much controversy, and there's been rumor and innuendo surrounding Bruce Mitchell of The Torch for supposedly being the guy to send that tape to get viewers' choice to cancel the ECW pay-per-view. So even if you weren't necessarily on top of the story, it became a much bigger story when there were implications for the pay-per-view. But you guys now dig way deep into not the business side of it, but the personal side of it. Of course, Eric is no longer with us, but Mass Transit's father, Eric's dad, he's still around. And then I think you guys say in the documentary, declined to participate. Talk to me about, what that process was like trying to get him on board and why ultimately he decided not to.
Well, Stephen Kulas, Eric Kulas's father he actually has passed away.
Okay.
And one of the things, I'll just go back a little bit. One of the things that we wanted to do with this story is when we looked at the mass transit story and how it's been covered before and what the fans' reaction to it has been over the years, it just felt so ripe for rediscovery, not for a number of reasons. One is you tend to get the reaction from wrestling fans. Oh, he deserved it. How dare this kid lie about his age and, lie about his experience and, he deserves this, or whatever. And it's interesting to see just the side that wrestling fans take on this story. So I felt it was really important just for us to do our due diligence and to see if there is another side to this story. And so our office had reached out to the Kulas family, and Eric Kulas's mom answered the phone, and right from the get-go, it became very apparent that this incident was an extremely traumatic experience for the entire family, and actually more or less completely destroyed it. And my biggest regret, I think my biggest regret in the entire Dark Side of the Ring, perhaps, is not being able to convince her to participate in the show. Because that perspective would have added so much to this episode. Because basically the narrative that you get on this story for so many years is essentially New Jack's side of the story. You don't really get to see the mass transit side of the story. And so when we were talking to her, she was very, very upset about the whole thing. And she basically told us that she couldn't go back there. She couldn't go back there to even talk about this. And that was just too difficult for her. And the reasons for that is essentially after it happened, from my understanding, we hadn't had a chance to interview her. So my understanding is that after this happened, as Tiny the Terrible says in the episode, it changed Eric, which it definitely did. And over the course of the next few years, he was struggling with his weight. He got a operation, and he essentially was struggling also with a lot of mental health issues following this. And he more or less kind of ate himself to death. I mean, that's really kind of what happened. And after that, Eric's brother, who was also there the night that the incident took place, he has just got out of prison, and he's been living an entire life of crime, getting in and out of jail ever since this happened. And it spiraled him downward and put him on that path as well. And then the father just recently passed away, I think a few years ago, and he had been struggling with it ever since. And so it was like, wow, this would be a bombshell to be able to put in the episode to show this completely different perspective about how, like, in wrestling, this is celebrated almost as one of the more infamous moments in the ring, but now here's the real human consequences and casualties of this thing. And but unfortunately, it didn't work out. We weren't able to get her, and that's why at the end of the episode we wanted to make mention of that, at least that those attempts were made. And I even talked to Eric Kulas's mother's lawyer he called me and was like, because I was still trying to make communication with her to try to get on in this, and basically the attorney was like, you're going to talk to me now, and you can handle it with me, and her attorney really wanted her to do this because they were really interested in getting the Kulas family story out there. It's just she just couldn't open that door. She just could not do it. And so for us, it's one of the things when I sit back and I watch the episode, I just kind of imagine if you were seeing New Jack's side of the story, which is exhilarating to listen to, but then you were just to hear the other side of it, it would have a completely different effect.
Well, the other person that's involved in this mass transit story who does appear on the episode is a character named Tiny the Terrible. And Evan, when you first sent me a screener link a couple of weeks ago to give you some feedback on this episode, my first response was, I love Tiny the Terrible. This dude needs his own show. Jason, this feels like it would have been an off the rails day with Tiny the Terrible. Tell me about your experience working with him.
Oh man, it was incredible. Probably one of the highlights of, I think, creating both seasons of the show. I remember when he was first pitched to us in the office as a potential interview subject. We can only have so many subjects in the show, and we can only afford to go so many places. So at one point, there was a time when we were possibly not going to interview him. But then I did more research on him, and I found he had done this documentary called A Man Among Giants, which is about him running for mayor of I think it was Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And
yeah, he ran for mayor. I just want to emphasize that.
Yeah, and I think I watched that doc maybe 3 times in a row that night. And I just kept blowing up Evan's phone. I was like, man, we have to go to Tiny the Terrible. This is all I want to do right now. And so we went, and it was such a trip. It was so cool. When we got into his apartment, he showed us that he had this incredible collection of action figures that he made himself, that he handmade. I think there were maybe 300 or 400 action figures.
It was insane.
And he created his own universe, and I think he has a couple clips on YouTube that he calls ghetto altered is what he calls the universe. And so he's got Whoopi Goldberg is the Superman in this world. So he's got a Whoopi Goldberg action figure that's Superman, and just so many other iconic African-American actors as action figures. And then I look over, and he's got there's a Nazi woman doll, and I'm like, who's this? And he's like, oh, that's Hitler's girlfriend.
Oh,
I was like, oh. I was like, do you have Hitler's action figure? And he's like, yeah, I got it right here. And he pulls it out, and he puts them side by side. And I was like, oh, so are these the villains in your world? And he's like, villains? He's like, these are the heroes.
Oh no.
What? I couldn't wrap my head around it, but it was so it was so fascinating. And he had a whole story and a background to all of the characters. It's something we filmed, and I spent a lot of time filming it. And yeah, he even went to the point of he showed me this one action figure that had an afro on it. And I got closer to it, and he said, yeah, I made this afro with my pubes.
Oh, oh.
And it totally gives you a new meaning to #scratch that figure itch.
Oh, God.
Shout out to Zack Ryder and Kurt Hawkins. My goodness.
Oh man.
No, yeah, he was he had held the action figure up to your camera lens, and he's like, yeah, this one's interesting because I actually had to use my dick hair on it. And I was like, oh my God. And just he just had all of these handmade action figure. It was so overwhelming. And we actually filmed we are, as soon as we get through the season, it's going to be our own little mini doc that we're going to edit, essentially, of him talking about just all of his action figures that he's made. I mean, I don't know if Zack Ryder's listening, we can maybe hook him up with that as a exclusive. I'm sure
these are the most beautiful, coolest action figures I've seen produced out of the wrestling world. That's for sure.
It's unbelievable that this even is part of the story. But the other part of the story I found interesting was Tiny the Terrible's little argument with Eric Kulas's father, like about whether or not he could ride back with him. That whole relationship seems like an interesting dynamic. Is that fair to say, Evan?
Yeah. So looking into how deep the rabbit hole goes on mass transit, was when something, again, we just didn't know, we would never have known, is that there's a history between Tiny the Terrible and the Kulas family that way predates the mass transit incident. They're from kind of the same area in Rhode Island. And Jason, you might remember the story better than me, but wasn't it that Tiny the Terrible, when he was in, I think, school, like that? You want to take it?
Yeah, he was in school and he rode the bus home every day after school, and his father was very protective of him and always made it a point that, like, as soon as you are done school, I want you to come home, like, as soon as possible. And so Tiny was on the bus and they're driving, and Eric Kulas's father was Tiny's bus driver growing up. And so I guess that's kind of where the mass transit gimmick comes from, is it sounds like almost kind of like a dedication to his father in a lot of ways. And so
totally.
So I guess Tiny, one day he pulled for his stop and Steven blew past the stop, and Tiny got really pissed off and confronted Steven about it. And I guess, according to Tiny, Steven chased after Tiny and picked him up and threw him. And Tiny was like late getting home from school that day, and his dad, I think, was like really upset with him, and he had to explain the whole story to him. So yeah, they had this like previous beef, and so that's like when you see there's that argument in the mass transit episode where Steven and Tiny are like at each other. It is because there was this pre-existing tension between them, and somehow they like got over it before going to the mass transit or going to that event that night. Yeah, Tiny was like really angry with Steven.
Yeah, just to throw into that too, from what I recollect, Tiny always thought Eric was cool.
Yeah.
Like Eric was always nice to Tiny. And they had sort of developed this relationship. And then when they started wrestling together, one of the things that was cool to see on the internet or on social media last night when the episode premiered is, you get to see all the mass transit scholars that are out there, because they're out there. And and a lot of people were really impressed with the fact that we were able to locate that footage of Tiny the Terrible and his brother performing with Eric, at some fairground somewhere, which was a whole Mission Impossible story into itself in terms of getting Tiny to unearth that tape from his closet and actually mail it to us, which he did. But yeah, it's just so interesting because you always have heard that story. I think when I go back, I think now I remember how we kind of arrived at Tiny was when you read about the mass transit incident or you hear about it, you always get that detail of Eric showing up to the ECW match with two little people.
Right.
And it was kind of like, and then I think I remember we turned to each other like, who are they? What's their story? In this. And I think that's when the Pandora's box opened from there.
Well, the other guy who was interviewed about this subject is Sandman, and he talks about going on Next and Bleeding Augusta trying to take the quote unquote heat off of New Jack. But he also seems to learn exactly what New Jack's beef was and why he cut mass transit. When you guys tell him the sort of the backstory, how was Sandman to work with and how was he through this project?
Oh man, Sandman was amazing. And I have to just say, growing up as a wrestling fan, like Sandman was really my Stone Cold Steve Austin growing up, like for real. I was fortunate enough because I grew up in Minneapolis, and at the Mall of America, LOL, in Minneapolis, there was actually an RF video kiosk in the mall, which was so crazy. And you could go to the mall and you could basically buy these ECW VHS tapes growing up. So when I was probably 14, 15, maybe, I had, got these ECW tapes, had no idea what it was, and then seeing the Sandman, I mean that, oh my God, I mean it was a big deal to me at the time, and so when he was probably like, we do a lot of these interviews with a lot of these wrestlers, people we grew up watching and everything, and it's very rare that I ask any of the subjects for a photo or mark out or anything like that. But Sandman was definitely one of those guys that I was like, all right, fuck it, I'm going to get a picture. But he was super cool, man. He was super cool, and someone needs to cast him as the Joker in something, I think. I don't know, I'm just going to put that out there.
Well, let's talk about another character who appeared in this story, and he jumps off the screen. He is a natural-born entertainer. Of course, I'm talking about Jim Cornette. What a joy was it to work with him and just get his commentary on some of the craziness of New Jack, especially the Smoky Mountain days.
Yeah, well, Jim Cornette is always our favorite stop on the road. I think, how many times do you think we've been to his house in the last 2 years?
Has it been like 6 times?
It could be. Yeah. It could be, yeah. It's always our favorite stop. He and his wife, Stacy, treat us like $1 million every time we show up. And he's just such a wealth of knowledge in terms of, you can literally put any subject in front of him and he's with no preparation and he can just roll. And this story we knew because he actually is involved in this story. And I always laugh when he talks about the New Jack thing, is where he almost looks at himself as the Dr. Loomis, in Halloween, kind of unleashing Michael Myers into the world of this whole story, which is always makes me laugh. But he's just so great to work with. It's kind of like when wrestlers talk about, how working with certain guys is like a night off. I mean, that's literally what it's like when we do interviews with Jim, because he's so good with the soundbite, and he makes our lives so much easier in the edit room in terms of just like, okay, boom, perfect. And he always is there to help us move the story along. And yeah, he's just, it'd be hard to do, some of these episodes without him.
It's so entertaining. I can't wait to see more of him this season. The other guy that pops up in this episode is D'Lo Brown. Why was D'Lo the right guy to talk to here? I mean, obviously he was with, New Jack and Smoky Mountain. I didn't know much of their real life relationship, but his commentary, in particular on the, I hate to laugh, but it's just funny when he watches the footage of New Jack stabbing William Lane, and he says, "Oh, he's stabbing this motherfucker." And it became a viral clip that you guys would post on social. And it tickled me every time because apparently D'Lo had never seen it. Talk to me about your experience, catching up with D'Lo.
Yeah. So D'Lo, being a part of the Gangstas, or I guess in the early incarnation of the Gangstas in Smoky Mountain, was somebody that was on our radar that we just love. He's such a good storyteller as well, and we knew we wanted D'Lo for other stories that you're going to see in this season. So he just felt like a good fit to cover kind of multiple episodes, and he was great. And I'm trying to think, but yeah, he didn't know about all of actually most of the people in this episode didn't know all of the New Jack incidents. A lot of people didn't know about the whole William Jason Lane incident. I mean, Jim Cornette didn't know about it, and we showed him for the first time, which you see in the episode. So that was just, completely entertaining, just to be able to see D'Lo kind of, have a raw reaction to that video. But yeah, D'Lo was fantastic.
Jason, from an outsider, if you're a non-wrestling fan, how off-putting will they be with wrestling genre when they realize the entire idea behind the Gangsters in Smoky Mountain was to generate, for lack of a better word, quote unquote, race heat?
Well, it's one of the interesting aspects. I think the most interesting aspect of like that tag team and how they generated heat, like from the audience. It really is like, I think like ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And D'Lo is really good at kind of talking about the nuances that's really kind of difficult to talk about on how like they were trying to get like racial heat from like the audience. And if they were getting racial slurs thrown at them, they knew that they were doing a good job, which is like, you just can't fathom that kind of idea in any other sport or art form,
especially today in today's world.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, definitely. And so yeah, that I think is like, I don't know. I think I think wrestling is always at its best when it's kind of commenting on the social issues of the current day, and they were definitely leaning on the racial tensions that were happening during like the LA riots at the time, and New Jack was definitely playing into the racial stereotypes that were like that were perceived before his time, and that also makes him kind of a groundbreaking character in a lot of ways. And we tried to show that in the episode about how he would take racial stereotypes and just throw it back into the audience's faces. And that, yeah, is like weirdly, like, I don't know. I think over time, it's crazy to say, but I think it does have like a therapeutic effect, or at least like some kind of, you get a better understanding of the times.
Evan, just staying on the race bit for a minute. It's clear that that's what he's looking for is quote unquote cheap heat in Smoky Mountain. And he's leaning heavily on the race issues in America to do that and just turning the volume up. But then we would see later, in his incidences with, Gypsy Joe and William Lane, he sort of uses the crowd buying into that race piece as fuel to further the attack. Do you think that's a cop out or an interesting dynamic of the mind of a madman?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a theme that keeps coming up when you look at all the stories that we cover in the episode, is just how these audiences throwing racial slurs at him throughout his whole career, and it's something that you have to factor into some triggering aspects for sure in terms of the things that he's done. And it's so complicated, again, when you look at the nature of performance in this way, and when playing a heel character and going that far and seeing the reaction it gets. But at the same time, it also does kind of have this effect to expose kind of just the way people are at their root, like when you see these shows and you see how people are reacting to it, it is disturbing. It is disturbing to imagine people like just feeling that they can do that they can shout that, that's a whole nother disturbing layer to this whole story. It's just like, the audience as well. But I did remember just now a story about D'Lo that we didn't get a chance to put in the episode, which is, New Jack was a bounty hunter before he was a wrestler, and also a little bit during the time when he was in Smoky Mountain, he also was doing some bounty hunting. And after a match one night, his beeper goes off. And whenever the beeper goes off, he's got like another bounty coming in. And so he turns to D'Lo because they had just finished up a match. And he's like, oh, there's a bounty like on the next town over, like an hour away. Do you want to come with me and we can split the bounty? And D'Lo's never, gone on a bounty before or anything. And so he agrees to go with New Jack. And he tells us the story about how after the match, they hop in the car, they drive over an hour away to this other town. And this is like 2 a.m, maybe 2 or 3 a.m. And New Jack's like, okay, D'Lo, you go around the back. And if the guy starts running out the back, just grab him. And New Jack walks in this guy's house in like 2 a.m. or whatever. And then basically D'Lo's like waiting outside the back door thinking like, am I going to get shot? Like, am I going to die? Like, is this the moment I'm going to die? And basically they go in and New Jack gets the guy, they throw him in the car, and they have to drive him like, I think like all night. Like they have to drive him like 5-6+ hours from wherever they picked him up all the way to, where there's, I don't know, where he's or like originates or where they're going to prosecute him or whatever. And, but just him telling us a story of like having to stay awake and driving the car throughout the whole night with this like guy that they just apprehended. Oh my God. It's a wild, wild story.
I also just thought of too, and I'm sure this is going to happen a lot as we do this, but I just remembered too who bankrolled Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and we tried to get him for the episode, was Rick Rubin.
That's right. Who
I guess you could also hold responsible for helping to create the character New Jack. But but yeah, Rick Rubin was someone who's produced like all like, I don't know, a bunch of the Beastie Boy albums. And
Every
Metallica,
hit record ever. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. And, you know, if this was a video, we could cue the montage of Rick Rubin marking out like at front row at a bunch of wrestling events. He's a major wrestling fan, but it would have been cool to have heard his perspective on all this too.
Did Rick not respond to your inquiries?
I can't remember exactly what happened, but you know, somebody.
I think, didn't we get a hold of him? But it was just like, it was too late. And I think he may have been interested, but it was too late at that point.
Well, I don't know if he had seen the show yet, because we have our friend Chris, who worked on season 1, was kind of the conduit. And we tried to, because, you know, he's a major wrestling fan, especially of the era that we mostly covered in season 1. And I think we tried to get him the show, and it was just kind of like hearing back, and just one of those things that didn't quite land into place when we needed it to. But yeah, definitely something we tried to do for sure on this episode.
Somebody else who's missing from the episode, but did appear afterwards in the After Dark episode is Mustafa, his longtime partner through both Smoky Mountain and ECW. Did Mustafa initially have some hesitation in participating, or did you guys meet up with him and it just wound up on the cutting room floor?
Oh, it's definitely a regret. I'll be honest. It's definitely a regret. Like Jason said earlier, there's only so many people that we can actually afford to go see. I mean, that's the truth. We have a set budget for each episode. It's not a big budget. And sometimes, I mean, you know, like literally our budget is like when we travel on the road, you know, we were telling you we have 4 people on the road that we travel with. We can only somehow afford 3 hotel rooms. I don't know how that works out, but that's the truth. So, it's like, it was just one of those things where it was a choice. And I do regret it, because I think it would have been great to have Mustafa there, especially because then we could have asked him, did you smoke pencil shavings, and why?
What a great note. I was really disappointed in After Dark when nobody brought a pencil shaving.
I know.
That's like, we just teed it up. I mean, how could you not? How could you not?
Well, the other person I wanted to ask about is Vic Grimes, who I'll admit I mistakenly a few weeks ago on What Happened When with Tony Schiavone, I mentioned that Vic Grimes had passed away. I was mistaken. Vic Grimes is alive and well, although New Jack tried to help him with that during the XPW show. What about Vic Grimes' story? Did you guys reach out to him, and what did you learn about the Vic Grimes incident? And most importantly, how in the world did you find the ability to license XPW footage?
Oh my Lord. Okay. Well, Vic Grimes, no, we didn't reach out to Vic Grimes, as we knew in kind of scripting the story that it was going to be just a smaller piece of the story.
Right.
And again, having to figure out how are you going to spend this budget to travel, and how are you going to map it out? And it was just one of the decisions that we made. However, in putting the XPW footage in the episode, it was the last minute. And I'm telling you, the last minute. When was this, Jason? Like 2 weeks ago?
Oh,
man. 3 weeks ago?
I think so. Yeah, 3 weeks ago.
I'd say 3 weeks ago. Because we've been trying to locate, I can't remember his name, you might remember, but we tried to locate the fellow who owned XPW to be able to license his footage. And I think it just was like this, you know, where in the world is this, you know, we couldn't find him. And somehow we had gotten this tip that he owns, or he works at a restaurant, or he owns a restaurant, and it might be a gentleman's club or something like that he either works at or he owns. I couldn't remember. And we can't get this guy on the phone. We can't get him on email. So we actually hired one of our friends.
Yeah.
To someone you've grown up with, right?
Yeah, it was a friend of mine I grew up making movies with, who he's helped us along the way. He's a big wrestling fan, and he's helped us with a couple things. And I remember, yeah, like you said, this was 3 weeks ago. I came out of the editing booth and I saw Glenn. His name's Glenn Matthews. And I saw him standing there, and there's a bunch of you guys are talking to him, and someone tells me, yeah, we're going to like send him down to he's going to drive down to the States and stake out this, like, was it like an ice cream restaurant to try and get the right for this? And I can't remember. I was like, is this a joke? Like, what are you putting my friend through right now?
No, I was like, we're going on a mission. And it was Glenn had to drive from Toronto to Rochester, New York, 5-6 hours. And his mission was to stake out this gentleman's club. And he had to wait outside in the car to see if he could spot this guy walking in. And then he would spot him, go in, and basically say, hi, I'm with this show, and we need to license this Vic Grimes footage immediately. And so we basically were getting live updates every hour. And then it was literally like we got the text message, target acquired, and like he went in to he met the guy, sat down with him, and then I heard like, okay, we got an update. They're like sitting down and they're having like energy drinks together. Okay, great. He's talking. He seems positive. Seems good. Okay, great. And then like it was just like it took all day, but I think by like the literally 8 or 9 p.m. after hanging out with this guy drinking energy drinks the whole day, we're like, we finally got him to sign. And it was like the lengths we had to go to just to be able to show that fall is like pretty wild.
And to be clear, you went to Rob Black's establishment in order to do this? I mean, that's who would have owned the footage, right?
I believe that was his name. Yeah.
Yeah, Rob Black.
Yeah.
Dude, you got to get down the rabbit hole on that. He used to own an adult film company. He used that to fund XPW and allegedly put a hit out on another wrestler who may or may not have been with his wife and tried to cut his penis off. And there's a lot of craziness behind that. And I think the restaurant you're talking about is American Cheeseburger in Rochester.
That's right.
That is it. American Cheeseburger. Yeah.
Because at one point I texted Glenn and I'm like, what's going on? He said, I'm watching this guy flip burgers. Like, what? He's like, and then Glenn was like, yeah, he had to go back on his shift. He can't sign anything until he's done flipping these burgers. And I was like, okay.
This is amazing, man. What an interesting tangled web professional wrestling can be.
So what you're saying is that, Conrad, we might have put Glenn in harm's way.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm glad he left with his penis in place. Let's talk about,
sorry, Glenn.
Let's talk about spaghetti for a minute. We learned when we met MWW, who I feel like could also have his own YouTube series, that New Jack is a hell of a cook, particularly with spaghetti. Talk to me about the MWW CD that Jason, I think you posted.
Oh yeah.
Yes. This is a character and a half, right, Jason?
Oh man, absolutely. When we rolled up to his house, like his apartment was really, it was tiny. So like we could only go in there like one at a time pretty much to like set up. And so me and the sound mixer, Adam, we both went in. I was looking for a spot to set up the camera, and MWW, who used to also go by the name CB Kane, who was the promoter of Thunder Wrestling.
Yep.
Yeah, and a wrestler, yeah. And he just started putting on some music. And while we were setting up, and Adam and I, we were like grooving to it, and we're like, what is this? And he's like, oh, this is my album. And he had this like corner of the apartment like blocked off. And I kind of looked over and I saw he had this whole recording set up there. And we just got really into it, and we just had him play the music like the whole time we were setting up. As we left, he gave us like a copy of the album, and for like weeks we played that album on repeat while we were on the road.
Months.
It was just it stuck into our brains. Like it just haunted our minds. But it's so good. I definitely like his album's out there. It's on Spotify. It's on YouTube. You got to check it out. I'm one thing we're really obsessed about too is like music that's created in the wrestling scene, like wrestlers who have made albums, and we collect them like as we are on the road and try to track them down. And so that album for us in a lot of ways is a little bit of like a little holy grail artifact that we really hold dear to our hearts.
Yeah, if there's a way we can put some MWW on at the end of this episode or something, that would be great. Thanks.
Say no more, fam. I got you. By the way, you can find his work very easily. Just throw in your Google machine, MWW Music. Really remarkable. He'll play us out here today, and as well he should. He's the promoter when, and we've referenced it a few times, William Lane, the guy in Florida who got stabbed. MWW is the promoter of that show. Whatever happened to William Lane? Did you guys find out?
Could not find William Lane. Again, just a lot of resources were thrown. Maybe somebody, if had we put it out there in the Twitterverse, we would have been able to. But of course, we wanted to, keep everything close to our hands when we were producing this. But couldn't find him, honestly. Just we had tried because we were going down to that area. We were already going to be in Jacksonville, and just couldn't find him. But one thing I want to just also bring up about MWW is that when Jason and I go on the road and we talk to a lot of these wrestlers, something that we've developed and we've honed over the course of these past couple of years is the ability to know when we're getting worked. Like our work meter is like it has gotten more experienced. It's getting stronger. Yeah, it's getting stronger. And this might be the interview that we were worked the most, I think. And I'm not trying to throw shade or trying to, like MWW. I mean, we love his music, huge fans, but definitely there was some, it was it was definitely like, that can't be true. Come on, and I'm not talking about spaghetti or anything. I'm talking about like the actual event itself. He kind of, distanced himself from it. Because the whole incident with William Jason Lane, he was like, oh, I wasn't watching, the monitor or whatever, watching the event as it was happening. And which was like, come on, how could you not be watching your own event, especially when you have New Jack on? And then he said that somebody had alerted him that there was something going on in the ring. And so he went down to the ring. And in both of the actual footage, and there's multiple angles that you can access on that footage. You see MWW coming out to approach New Jack, and there is a little bit of a confrontation that occurs there. I think New Jack might even like hit him, and then he kind of grabs him by the collar. And the way MWW was telling the story was that he came out there to talk to New Jack, and New Jack was just, he was as calm as could be, and he just, was lying next to William Jason Lane. And he was just, he had put an arm around William Jason Lane, and he was just trying to comfort him there while he was laying on the ground. And I'm thinking like, what are you talking about? He's got his foot on his head and he's like crushing his head. And then like he's grabbing you by the collar. It was bizarre. Like the whole tone of the interview, I think, was either like in fear of New Jack, like in fear of what he was going to say, or just it was just that old promoter working you type thing.
Fascinating. Well, Jason, let's ask the question everybody wants to know. How much fun did you have filming the cocaine scene at the end of the doc?
Well, that was a question I asked at the end of our New Jack interview. I think it was the last question. I asked him if there was a movie about his life, what would he want the ending to be? And then he said, to be in a wheelchair, snorting cocaine, like into his 80s, basically. And so, yeah, we knew as soon as he said that, Evan and I knew we were going to be filming that, and that was going to be the end shot of the episode. And yeah, I thought it turned out pretty good.
Yeah, that was just, I mean, and that was the last shot we filmed for that episode.
It was,
right? Yeah, I think so. It's just even more apropos.
It was down to the wire, because like literally the AD and the assistant director had like a stopwatch, because we have to stop like right on the time, and you were on the other end of the wheelchair and you pushed him into frame while we were rolling, and that as soon as the camera cut, we were done for the day.
Jason, inquiring minds want to know, did you use shooting cocaine or working cocaine?
It's a shoot.
It's a shoot.
Let's get to Twitter. We posted earlier this morning that we were going to be recording and said, hey, if you guys have a question for Evan or Jason, fire away. And lots of questions about stuff that we've already covered here today. But one that stood out to me was there any topic that was deemed off limits by New Jack, or was he pretty open about everything that was asked of him?
I mean, he was open. I mean, he's very open. You ask him something and he'll give you an answer. It's just whether or not, like, when we asked him about being a Dusty Rhodes fan that he's alleged or he's talked about in other interviews. I mean, he's like, no, that's not true. So you might just get something where he shoots it down, but there was nothing off limits.
Let's talk about the other documentary that he's appeared in. Jeffrey writes in, did you guys watch Beyond the Map before starting work on the New Jack episode? Because he is a central character in that movie. I think everybody who's seen it knows that Barry Blaustein took him to do some reads or some table reads and audition for some different parts. And I think one of the casting directors said maybe he wouldn't be Denzel, but he would be Denzel's friend. He then shows his knuckles to the camera, talks about being a bounty hunter, says he has no knuckles from quote unquote beating a bitch in the eye. I mean, he is a over the top character on Beyond the Mat. Was that one of the reasons you think he is on everyone's radar to begin with?
I think for a lot of people, like I've seen that brought up in the last week a lot more, and from friends of mine who weren't too familiar of New Jack, but they knew him from that documentary, which we love that documentary.
Mm-hmm.
But when we approached this, I don't think we really focused on that on that aspect of the doc. But you could see, like, obviously just spending time with New Jack, like and seeing his performance, he is so charismatic. Like there could have been a world maybe where he could have been an actor in films. But yeah, he definitely has like a charisma to him that, the camera just loves him.
And I just remember watching Beyond the Mat when it came out, and that might be one of the early times where I became aware of New Jack, because so it's possible. But I mean,
yeah, that's
definitely true. that scene of him doing the table read is incredible.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a question that we got more often than any other, and it really stood out to me that people had this on their mind. This one in particular, John Owens writes in, was there any thought to touching on the Terry Runnels relationship, Evan?
I will admit that it was another thing I was like, oh shoot, I forgot to ask about. I literally remember, I think a day after, like the interview, and being like, that was one thing that I had forgot to ask about, because I was also curious about that. And it's something that I didn't know until like right before we did the interview. I didn't even know they had that relationship. So, but yeah, sadly, unfortunately, it didn't make its way onto my interview question list.
Jason, have you seen the often talked about picture of Terry Runnels, quote unquote, getting color?
No, I have not.
Yeah, that happened during the relationship and went a little underground viral, and everybody was like, what in the world is going on? And it was one of the most requested questions here. So I thought I'd bring it up, but I wasn't sure if it was maybe out of bounds. It doesn't feel like it really fits in the story necessarily, but it does show you more of the craziness surrounding his life.
Definitely. I mean, I don't know.
Evan, how much do you think of these sort of in-ring incidences that we saw? Well, King Matthew writes in, if you ever wondered how New Jack prepared for a match, it's always the same. I like the way he said it too. Quote, I was in the back doing cocaine and I was high as fuck. How much of a contributing factor do you think drugs have been to some of the over the limit violence we've seen from New Jack in the ring?
Man, it's hard to say, but I mean, it can't be discredited. I mean, it's also just one of the other aspects of the story that is disturbing when you look at it, because, traditionally in wrestling, this should be a safe environment, right? For people to, because you are in wrestling, you're trusting your body with somebody else. I mean, that's the foundation of it. You should always try and leave the ring the way that you came into it, kind of one of the golden rules, I suppose. And it is just kind of one of the more disturbing aspects of it is, that level of trust that you have, with your opponent. I certainly wouldn't be getting in the ring with New Jack if I was a wrestler, and basically trusting him with that. So yeah, that was kind of one of the more aspects that, one of the things we wanted to show is, yeah, that is one of the more, I don't know, disturbing, unfortunate aspects of the story.
Yeah, I saw just like a little like shoot interview thing that someone posted last night with New Jack talking about like how he did some of those 40-foot balcony jumps, and he said, "How else do you think I did it? By doing a bunch of cocaine, basically." Like, and I guess like that, maybe that's what gives you the courage to do something like that, because man, when you see some of those drops,
it's crazy.
He's falling to the point where there's that like little second where your gut drops, where you're like, oh my God, that's like, it's a little too long for someone to fall into something that is not water or a giant crash mat or a bunch of boxes. He's just landing on another person from like 40 feet above. Like, you would have to be running on something to help you get courage to do something like that. I would think. I don't know. Never seen anyone else do anything like that.
Yeah, I had the good fortune, I guess you would call it, to see New Jack do some of those dives live in person. And seeing it on TV is one thing, but actually being in the building when you see a human just fall like that, it's something else. And so is this episode. Jason, let's put a bow on New Jack here. If you had to describe, New Jack to an outsider, a non-wrestling fan, and explain what this episode was about, how would you sum it up in a sentence or two?
Oh man. I guess I don't know. It's hard. It's tough for me to say, but the way I've kind of talked to my friends about it, I bring it back to, how I kind of connected to the story, in the sense that how I love wrestlers who really blur those lines, who it's hard to differentiate who's the character from the person. And, like I was saying before, like I kind of romanticize that a little bit, even though New Jack has done some horrific things to people. I think like his legacy will go on as something that people will be really fascinated with for generations to come. And he's like very unique in a way that people never saw a gimmick like his before. And I don't think we've ever seen a gimmick like it since. And so, like it or not, he is someone who like really pushes the boundaries in the wrestling world. And Jim Cornette says in the episode, it's someone that he can even believe in, like that the character is like real. And so that I think really makes it, I don't know, fascinating for us.
Well, I will also throw onto that too, like just kind of going back to what I was saying before. It was a thing we wanted to look at, was that idea of, where do you draw the line, right? Between, and I think Jim Cornette puts it perfectly, of between working and wrestling and like felonious assault. And I don't want to minimize the fact that they're also, people were messed up in a lot of these instances. I mean, you see, because if you're hearing us now talk about how the Kulas family was destroyed by this, and then also talking about, William Jason Lane, he's lucky to probably be alive. And of course, we know Vic Grimes is lucky to be alive. I mean, had that incident been just like a foot or two different in the way he landed, I mean, he might not be here. So you can't also minimize the fact that, there are, some instances here that are pretty horrifying. And we did want to kind of present that in a way that people could look at that, and even though the story is exhilarating to listen to, and it's wild, and there's some wild characters involved, it kind of presents you with that and saying, how do you feel about this? And that was one thing that I saw online yesterday, was a lot of different people having different sides. And it did provoke that discussion, which is kind of what we always want to try and do with our episodes, is we want to kind of leave people at a crossroads. And that's going to be much more evident as we talk about some of the other stories that are coming up this season. But it is kind of, where do you fall in this? And I saw a lot of indie wrestlers talking about that issue of trust in the ring and how that is completely broken. So, I think that's just another thing that I would add on top of, how I would describe it to somebody.
Evan, there was so much negative, so much bad in the Benoit story you did last week, but you tried to find a silver lining of, let's put Daniel Benoit and Nancy's family back together again. And it really did sort of have a happy ending to a really, really sad story. Is there a silver lining or a happy ending to the New Jack episode?
I mean, it's kind of what I was just saying. I mean, it's like, I think it's in your perception of the story, in anyone's perception of the story. And one thing that's interesting is you can look at that last shot when New Jack sums up, if his life were a movie, how would you want it to end? Right? It is a funny concept, but also at the same time, it's kind of like, that's his perception of himself. Right. And so I don't know. I don't know if it does kind of end. I think you could look at it not ending with a silver lining, because I don't know. There is something also just inherently disturbing about all of it, I think.
Yeah.
And that was something that we wanted to try and present, even though that moment at the end over the credits when he's talking about, dumping, or we have cocaine dumping all over him and everything. I mean, that is kind of, I don't know how he views himself, right? I mean, that's the be all end all for New Jack. So that is kind of, could be looked at as disturbing too.
And for the record, Jason, that was hashtag shoot cocaine. Jason, give us a preview for next week. We saw a commercial here in this episode. Brawl for All is up next. What can we expect from a Brawl for All episode next week, Jason?
Yeah, the Brawl for All episode is something that, like, a lot of people asked us, like, how were we able to tell a full hour of television, the story of like the Brawl for All? How could we fit that story into a full hour? And it was actually like very easy in a lot of ways, because there's a really, I don't know how you say it, but like a dark, I guess people have said to us, like, what's the dark side of like the Brawl for All? And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of darkness to it. Like, here is a story about a bunch of mid-card wrestlers who are looking for a way to get a push. And at the time, the WWF come up with this gimmick to basically have wrestlers do real shoot fights, to actually put on boxing gloves and fight for real, and ask the audience that has already been, are in on the staged wrestling performances that they're seeing, and now they're asking the audience to watch real shoot fights, and a lot of people have said it's like the worst idea probably that's ever been conceived in the wrestling industry. And as we dove into it more and more, we realized that in a lot of ways that could be the case. A lot of people got hurt and a lot of careers got ruined. So yeah, it's a it's a crazy one.
Yeah, and it also kind of goes into that issue of trust in the ring when it gets completely thrown to the wayside, and there's kind of a vehicle for that. And like one of the things that's disturbing to me about the Brawl for All is you really see a host of guys who, some of them have been in bar fights. Of course, there's Dan Severn, who's a decorated UFC fighter and stuff. But for the most part, you're looking at a bunch of guys who are really in over their head, out of their element, especially when it comes to like, live television, TV cameras being on you. And like, now we're just going to beat each other up for real. There is something kind of sad. I'm going to say, I think it is sad. There is a sad kind of disturbing quality to it when you see these guys kind of naively going into it when they have the carrot dangled in front of them of like, okay, this is going to accelerate your career. And this is going to be the thing that, gets you to have that run, with Steve Austin or whatever, or that's at least the mindset that they're subscribing to. And then when you see like, here's a guy like Bart Gunn who, triumphs in this event, you see that, his reward, which he thought was going to be this, this new stardom for himself, where probably just had he not participated in the Brawl for All, he might have just completely, his contract might have not gotten renewed and he would have fallen by the wayside. But now in this event, he's triumphed overall. And then we see that, any hope for him to get that rub is completely squashed when he gets decapitated by Butterbean at WrestleMania. So it is kind of this tragic hero story. So I think what people are going to see next week is that, the Brawl for All is this failed, concept, but there are real consequences to this kind of haphazard concept. And then at the same time, it really is the story of Bart Gunn. I mean, who would have thought in 2020 that we're going to see Bart Gunn on television? And who knows, maybe Bart Gunn will be trending on Twitter next week.
Jason, did that shock you when New Jack was trending on Twitter last night in 2020?
Yeah, Evan sent me a picture of it and I couldn't believe it. And then someone said that mass transit may have been also trending as well too.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
That's surreal.
Well, I know what's going to be trending next week, Evan. I've had a chance to see the Brawl for All episode. There is one of these sit down interviews in particular that's going to have a lot of people buzzing next week. Am I right?
Man, I don't even know what one we're talking about, but
a meltdown.
Russo?
There was a meltdown, in fact.
Oh yes,
an epic rant, one that will probably be replayed over and over. Such a character. You don't want to miss the episode. I don't want to give a spoiler here, but Brawl for All. It's coming up this coming Tuesday. So the countdown is on, 6 days away. It's Tuesdays, 10 p.m. Eastern. And I'm fired up, man. You can check your local listings. I've got DirecTV, but I've got it. I know it's also on Dish Network. And I think most of our listeners who can't see it internationally yet, they were able to enjoy the Benoit episode on YouTube. Evan, do we think the New Jack episode will be on YouTube anytime soon?
I don't know. I know I wish I did, but it tends to be this thing where Vice kind of decides, okay, we'll throw it on YouTube. And so I'm not sure, but for those who didn't catch the broadcast, usually it shows up on iTunes, on Amazon, where you can get it, you can purchase it there. Or, maybe someone will just upload it to YouTube and you can watch it there.
Yeah.
But anyway, you can see it, get your hands on it. We want to hear what you think.
We should also mention there is a Vice app. So if you have like a Roku or an Apple TV or something like that, you can download the Vice app, and there's probably an opportunity for you to watch there as well. I know I watched season 1, late last year. I watched it for the second time, and I did the Vice app to do so. So go out of your way to see the New Jack episode wherever you can, but you've got to find a way to have Vice on your TV next Tuesday, 10 p.m. Eastern. It's the Brawl for All episode, and I want to thank Jason and Evan for taking some time to catch up today. This is fun, man. Let's do this again next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I love it. Thank you.
And without further ado, man, let's get out of here and play a little MWW.
MWW.
See you next week right here on Dark Side of the Podcast. Hey, it's Conrad Thompson. Thanks for checking out the podcast here on YouTube. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notifications bell so you get a notice anytime we upload some new content. And go save yourself some money right now. If you're in a 30-year loan or you have credit card debt, it's not a matter of if I can save you money. It's a matter of how much. Find out right now for free at SaveWithConrad.com.